please jump in. So we'll start with qualitative methods. What are they? We'll briefly cover different kinds of interviews. Today we'll be focusing on semi-structured interviews in particular. Then we'll go over kind of like the nuts and bolts of running the interview, just kind of like some of the basics that you just really need to have under your belt so that you don't get tripped up. And then Chad will talk about interviewer skills and characteristics. He'll talk about that kind of messy human interaction that comes from two people getting into a room together and having a conversation. And then we'll just wrap up with some next steps and resources that we would like to send you home with so that you can continue to learn about, this data collection method. Chad, do you have anything else you want to add to the first slide? All right, then let's just go ahead and jump in.
Let's jump in. So we wanted to start by just talking briefly about what qualitative methods are and why we use them. And so qualitative methods are meant to emphasize meaning in contrast to what we do in quantitative research, which is to measure something, right? So we are using things like text, video, or audio, for example, and we're able to describe the phenomenon from using the perspectives of the people or the communities in which we are conducting our work. These methods are flexible, they are in person, and so data is collected by observing interactions between people, interviewing, holding focus groups. So necessarily these sorts of approaches allow for digging a little bit deeper into understanding social processes, understanding what's behind what's happening, and we are able to honor the voices of participants. Their voices are front and center. And by collecting this data in this way, we get to ask the why questions, the how questions, what questions that we can't really ask in a quantitative setting. These questions allow us to really get underneath what's happening and really understand what's behind a lot of what people are telling us in these interviews or in focus groups, for example. And so again, so whatever social phenomenon we are trying to understand, hold on, my computer just did something very strange. I can't see anything. Let's see if I can move that. Okay, I got it. Sorry about that. So whatever social phenomena we're trying to understand with qualitative methods, we want to explore what's going on in people's lives and try to understand what's behind their perspectives and the decisions that they make. So for example, how do their identities and their familial and social relationships shape the way that they see things and shape the way that they approach decision-making or whatever thing that we are trying to explore. We also have the opportunity to explore their experiences. So quantitative research is very effective at giving us an understanding of, say, the prevalence of something or what specific decision participants may have made. And in qualitative research, it allows us to explore the experiences that people have had, how those experiences have shaped subsequent actions and decisions. And as we all know from our own lived experiences, everything that we experience in our lives has some impact on what we do in the future and how we approach things and how we think about our decision-making and actions we engage in. And lastly, one that I focus on in my own work is that we get to explore the ways that people make sense of their social worlds. So surrounding the phenomenon, you want to understand our social norms and values, and people have different roles in their own lives. And those roles also factor into what occurs in their world and in their lives. And so we want to make sure we understand how people are processing information and how they are making sense of what's around them and factoring that into what we are trying to understand. And I want to end on giving you a quick example of just the different ways we may ask a question, right? So between quantitative and qualitative research. So if the domain of interest, for example, was the frequency that someone takes their medicine, something that we explore a lot in HIV research. A quantitative question might be, how many days did you take your medication last week? We sometimes ask people, in the last 30 days, how many days did you miss a dose of your medication? And so we may calculate the number of days they took their meds. We may calculate how frequently they missed their dose and then test to see if those are related to like their CD4 count or their viral load or other clinical outcomes. And so the variable of interest is the number of days that they've either taken their medication or missed a dose. In qualitative research, we would ask something more open-ended. This is a question from an interview guide that from a project Kim and I are working on right now. We ask people, how's it going taking your medication on a daily basis? What's it like to miss a dose? Tell me about that. And so in addition to getting, how often they're missing doses or, whether they're taking their medication every day, which usually comes up in the answers to these questions, we're also getting an understanding of the things that are contributing to them being able to take their medications or not, getting an understanding of their experience of taking medications. And when they miss a dose, what's that like? What does it feel like? And so instead of just looking at those clinical outcomes, we're getting a broader understanding of what's going on around the taking of their medications and whether or not they're missing doses. So I'm going to stop here and turn this over to Julia to talk to us about interviews. And let's see if you can forward that slide.
Let's just see.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Chad. So just different types of interviews that you might encounter. So we've got unstructured, semi-structured, and structured as kind of three big categories. With unstructured interviews, you have a very loose guide of rough topics. And so this allows for really a maximum flexibility for where the interview can go creatively. And so, this is like the most open-ended way of engaging someone in a conversation to collect data. And so a potential limitation of that from a research standpoint is that it might not be standardized enough for certain kinds of research design, but it does have the maximum flexibility for exploration and discovery. Then we have semi-structured interviews. So this is actually, you know what? I'll do structured first because that's semi-structured is a mix. So structured interviews are the most standardized, the least flexible of the styles of interviewing. So in this one, we ask each person very similar questions in very similar ways for standardization and to ensure that all of the topics are covered. So this has kind of the least room in it for stumbling across something that you weren't expecting or exploring a topic that comes up that you hadn't anticipated. Semi-structured interviews are the mix of the two, really. So this is where you have to make sure that you're going to cover several different important topics. And so the interview guide helps to kind of ground you in making sure that you cover those topics, but you have freedom to explore what comes up more spontaneously in the moment as you're progressing in the interview. So today we're going to focus on semi-structured interviews because those are the most commonly used in the health sciences. And someday I'll be able to advance my slide. Let's see. This is an adventure, Chad. Chad and I are trying the feature on Zoom where you can control each other's screens. There we go. All right. Oh boy. Okay, okay, what's happening? Okay, so before I jump into semi-structured interviews and the characteristics of semi-structured interviews more deeply, I want to just kind of highlight and draw a contrast between qualitative research interviewing and clinical interviewing. And so clinical interviewing and qualitative research interviewing do have some overlapping features. I mean, being able to engage someone, develop rapport, those are very important skills for both types of interviews. There are also some very important differences. And so it's important if you have a background in clinical training to be able to draw an awareness to the skills that you've developed as a clinician and to have an awareness of which of those skills translates appropriately into a research interview and which don't. So major differences are in a qualitative research interview, the interviewee is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting myself mixed up. So in the clinical interview format, the interviewer, meaning the clinician, is the expert of the topic. And the person being interviewed is coming to the expert, the clinician, for answers. In a clinical interview, it's necessarily very directive and time efficient. You don't have usually an hour and a half to explore in depth, different topics. You really need to get down to the point to achieve the goal of the clinical interview. So it begins broadly, and then the clinician's job is to quickly narrow down to identify the key information that they need in order to create a plan of action, or, at least that's my non-clinical understanding. There's a great article that is written by Hunt et al. And I've left the citation here, and it'll be in your list of reading that we'll send after this. And I found this very helpful for understanding kind of like what the key challenges are for transitioning from clinical to qualitative research. So if you have a clinical background, I really highly recommend that you go ahead and give this article a read. This is me pausing because I'm trying to advance my slide.
Got it.
There we go. Okay, so semi-structured interviews. So this is a formal conversation where you sit down in an assigned time. You're not just kind of running into study participants as they're going about their day-to-day lives. You sit down, you set a time apart to do it together. It is structured by an interview guide. And so what this is basically usually a Word document that has a list of questions and topics that need to be covered during the conversation, and usually in a particular order. But I'll give the caveat that a skilled researcher can kind of move between the orders as needed. So the important thing about this, though, is that this is a guide, not a script. So you're not going to sit down and simply kind of like, robotically go through the list of questions and deliver them and then receive an answer. It's a guide that helps you, like a compass, to navigate the landscape of the conversation with the study participant. So in order to be able to do that effectively, it's super important that you understand the purpose of the interview and that you're super familiar with the interview guide, so that you don't have to, engage with the participant and then suddenly look down, read the next question, come back to them, look down, read the next question. It really breaks up the flow and the rapport if you do that. And also so that you can be appropriately responsive to what the participant is saying in the moment, on the fly, and to probe appropriately. So we'll talk about what probing means and a few key strategies for probing in a minute. Still trying to forward. There we go. So semi-structured interviews use open-ended questions, overwhelmingly open-ended questions. And the reason for this is that it's a type of questioning that elicits ideas, beliefs, concerns, and narrative styles. So we want to know how the participant thinks about a subject at hand. We don't want to simply extract responses and information from them. And I don't mean to minimize how important it is to get that kind of information, but it's a different kind. You're trying to elicit a different kind of content than you would in a survey, for example. So it has an exploratory angle where you have not only permission, but really you are tasked with exploring the domains that are important to the study and about which little is known. So this requires a little bit of a willingness to have a sense of adventure in your interview, and to take some risks and to explore some different, highways and byways. And then if things aren't kind of going in a productive direction, that at that point, that's when you kind of come back to your interview guide, and you just use your interview guide as home or your compass in order to keep you moving on track. And flexibility is very much related to everything that I just said. So just to underline that we have flexibility and we have freedom to explore topics. This doesn't mean that we are not also tasked with managing our time and keeping on track. But it's important to not think of yourself in conducting a semi-structured interview as someone who's just delivering an interview guide or delivering a data collection tool to the participant. The guide is really a prop that you can use in order to facilitate the interaction. There we go. Okay, so now I will get into what Chad and I are thinking of as the nuts and bolts of the interview. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Well, there is a lot of content, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly. So if you have any questions, please just unmute yourself, jump in, and just interrupt me anytime you want. All right, so this is a quote that that Kim has found, and I adore this quote because I think one of the biggest things about interviewing when people try to transition into it or to learn about it is that there's kind of a misconception that it's a pretty simple thing to just sit down and have a conversation with someone and to record it and then to have that recording transcribed, and then boom, you've got data and you just did an interview. But doing an interview well, like that's the real challenge. So this person, Ralston, wrote, interviewing is much more difficult than I ever imagined it would be. What you do not see about interviewing from a surface observation is the utter complexity of the preparation and delivery process. It is only when you try interviewing that you realize there's much more to it than meets the eye. And I 100% agree with that. And I will tell you, to this day, I leave pretty much every single interview I run feeling completely exhausted and wondering if I did, you know, a sufficiently good job. It's a hard thing to do well.
And I will just say also, while Julia is talking, I'm monitoring the chat. So if you want to use the chat to give us, to ask questions or to make comments, please do. And I will interrupt and share those with Julia as she's talking.
This might be where I need you to go ahead and forward the slide for me, Chad, because it just won't go. There it went.
Yep.
All right, so preparing for the unknown. So a successful interview is really a negotiation between the interviewer and the interviewee. So this means that you do have to give up a substantial amount of control to the other person in order for it to go successfully. So that means that you have to be flexible, you have to be able to think on your toes, and you have to be prepared for contingencies. Ooh, Kim, yeah. How do you know if you've conducted a good interview? Is that, Kim, is that a conversation for everybody, or is that specifically for me?
I think, I really appreciate that you're telling the group that you feel vulnerable and insecure, even though you have a lot of experience conducting interviews. I think it is important to convey that we remain a little skeptical about whether or not the interview came off as, you know, considered, and we might consider it a good interview. So tell both Chad and Julia, tell us how you feel when you think you've succeeded in executing a good interview. How do you know?
I think it's, for me, most simply put, it's when I walk away just feeling super excited or moved. Chad, what do you think? How do you know when you've...
I would agree with that. When I think about a really good interview, I think about when walking away and thinking, God, I got so much really rich and important information from this interview. And so in those cases, I don't dwell so much on whether I, quote unquote, did a good job. I'm more focused on, you know, what the data is contributing to the work. And I'll say that the part of the insecurity about whether I've done a good job or not is because every interview is different. Every participant is different. Some people will talk and talk and talk and give you all the rich data, and other people, it's like pulling teeth. And so sometimes you feel like you didn't do a good job, but it really isn't about whether you know what you're doing. Sometimes it's about the person you're talking to that leads you to sort of feel that way.
And I'll just add to that also the day I've had, or what's going on in my life, or how exhausted am I, or, you know, what have you. So, and that's that messiness that is both very exciting and productive and also difficult, which I think Chad will be talking about later. Great, thank you. Somebody put the citation for the clinical interviewing article, and like I said, we'll also be sending out a list of suggested readings after this, and that'll be in there as well. And then there's a question about recorders and encrypted recorders. I can't say that I'm the best tech kind of person to ask about that. I just use a standard digital recorder. Does anybody have any suggestions for Kathy about recorders that they prefer or something like that? Oh, or Zoom recording, Kim says, yeah. Well, if anybody has any more suggestions about that, just go ahead and pop it into the chat or unmute yourself. But yeah, so this slide is just logistics. You don't want the logistics of the interview to be the reason that you end up flustered or something gets lost or your recording is deleted or what have you. So logistics are kind of boring, but they're super important. So always, always, always have a backup recorder. I had one situation where I ended up losing the end of I swear is one of the best interviews I've ever had. And I lost the end of it. And the participant very kindly kind of redid the end of the interview with me, but I managed to have both of my recorders mess up for different reasons. So if it can happen with two, it could certainly happen with one. So definitely always have a backup recorder. So having a private space with minimal noise and interruptions, the person needs to feel that they have privacy to really talk and be candid. And you also need to be able to hear them well. And it's a real bear if the transcriber can barely understand or hear what's going on, and you might even lose data that way. We need to always budget more time for an interview than you think. Like if you have scheduled an interview for a 60-minute time slot, you should have I would say an hour before that time slot and an hour after that slot blocked off as well. That's my rule of thumb, because things start late, they run over, the participant, gets lost getting to the site, like whatever the reason is, or they forget and they say, hey, can we start in 20 minutes, whatever it is. So I block 3 times the amount of time of the interview practically, if it's an hour interview. Asking them to turn off their cell phones if that's appropriate for them, and to prepare for interruptions during the interview, which the most important thing really is, like, do you know how to pause and restart your recording? Because that can be another tragedy of a way that you could potentially lose a recording. Martina, says, I've always used my phone and it is helpful because it blends into the environment, creates a more natural and comfortable space. And then there's a suggestion for a good app for downloading, recording, and transcription. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna let that conversation about recorders continue on the side. I'm gonna keep going. All right, so the nuts and bolts of the, oh boy. I'm trying to go back. If you could go back one, that'd be fabulous.
I'll go back for you.
Thank you. All right, so nuts and bolts of, like, you sit down with the person, you've got your recorder next to you, your recorders next to you, you've got your interview guide, etc. You're in a good place. How do you frame the interview? How do you get rolling? So it's really important to actually start with orienting the participant to the purpose of the study, and this could be with a script if necessary, so that the participant really understands what the research team is trying to do and they're informed about what the study is. And obviously all of this should be on the consent form, etc., but doing it again to really make sure they understand. Letting them know what to expect from the interview and what we want to learn from them is a much more, I think we get a much more productive interview from somebody who understands what we're trying to do and then can try to partner with us to achieve that. Sharing your background information, who you are, what's your role on the study, and the stage of research. So for example, if you're just starting out with your first interview, you can let them know, hey, we are just getting started, and you're the first interview. Remind them about how long the interview is, the time that you've set aside together, and any kinds of constraints that the person has that you need to be aware of. In my style of interviewing, what I usually do is I say, today you and I have set aside 60 minutes for this interview. I completely respect that if at 60 minutes you need to go and you have something else that you need to do, we will just stop the conversation wherever we are at that point. But if you're enjoying the conversation, if you're on a roll, I can be here all day talking to you. And that's what I say, and that might not work with your study design, but that's how I handle that. And also remind the participant that, they really don't have to talk about anything that they are not comfortable talking about. So if I ask you about something and you're not comfortable responding to it, just say, let's skip that and move on. And then I'll skip it and move on. And that the participant has the right to stop the interview at any time. And then before that whole kind of preamble, the last thing that I say before I turn on the recorder is just to check in. Do you have any questions or anything else you'd like to talk about before I turn on the recorder? Oh, it forwarded. How about that? Okay, so now how do we go about, actually, Chad, can you just advance down the whole length of the slide so that we can just, otherwise it's going to be painful. So framing questions in semi-structured interviews. So what and how questions are open-ended kinds of questions. Who and when help to clarify facts and details. And we also want to, of course, understand why people do things or feel things or what have you. But it's important that we don't ask questions in a way that make people feel defensive or that we are judging or questioning their reality and their lived experience. So a nice way of elaborating can be to frame it more as, can you tell me more about that? So how does that work when that happens, or how did that happen that you made that decision? Instead of, why did you do that? And how did you come to that point of view or that decision or that perspective instead of why do you feel that way? Yes and no questions are not going to get you very far in terms of getting nice, juicy, rich interview content for your analysis. We do need to ask yes or no questions when we need to just get details in order to understand important facts that help us to understand the story the person's telling, but we don't want to ask questions that are going to get us very short informative answers that are just very short and not very rich. So avoiding multiple choice questions or confirm or deny questions. So an example would be if you're trying to understand something and you don't really understand the topic, like a very human normal thing to do in conversation would be to say, is it like you did it for this or that or the other reason? And then you've given the person 3 options to choose from, which kind of frames the whole universe of their response. So you've really influenced the kind of response that they're going to give you. And the same thing with confirm or deny questions. Like if you say, oh, would you say that it's like this or it's like that? Then you've again kind of like limited their universe of responses. And we really don't want to do that. We don't want to insert ourselves in that way into the interview. We insert ourselves in all kinds of other ways, but not that way. Chad, do you mind forwarding? And if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in as always, Chad. All right, so this is an example of an interview transcript that Kim provided, and I love it, so I kept it. So this is a question that is very open-ended, and so please tell me about, can you please describe, how did it happen that? These are all very open-ended questions, and the little like test I do in my head really quick to make sure I'm not asking a closed-ended question is I just try to imagine the type of response a person could give. So if I say, please tell me about that, they can't say yes or no as a response, right? Or they can't, it's very hard for them to give a one-word answer. So here we have a nice open-ended question, and then we get this great kind of juicy big paragraph response that has a whole bunch of different stories in it and different dynamics between people in this person's life. And so there's just so much more rich understanding of this person's story of their living arrangement than you could get with a closed-ended question. So Chad, if you wouldn't mind forwarding to the next slide. So here's an example of what happens on this topic of a person's living arrangements if we just ask a confirm or deny, yes or no kind of question, and then we just get, yep, that is correct, I live on 3rd Avenue, but we don't have any understanding of how living on 3rd Avenue came about, any personal stories that might be involved in it. It's just it's just very it's not rich data. Okay. Next.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add, Julia, is in the first question, the first example, sometimes even when you ask a really open-ended question, you do have participants who will give you a very quick, short answer. And so there are times in interviews where even though you've asked a really broad, open-ended question, with some participants, you may need to just ask a lot of questions to get to what you want to understand, because some people just don't talk a lot. So you come in contact with lots of different kinds of personalities.
Absolutely. I think that's like a perfect, yes, Chad, that's like a perfect transition into probing and following up. So when we have that situation where a person is given a very brief, not very rich or elaborated response, or maybe they've responded in a way that you can't completely understand or make sense of, that's when we need to probe and we need to follow up. So following up is a critical aspect of semi-structured interviewing. And you can anticipate it and prepare for the different kinds of probes that you might need to use. Probes are the questions or requests that do not appear directly on the interview guide, so it's not going to be printed on the Word document that's in front of you. I will say this is where the interviewer needing to have a really good understanding of what the goal of the study is. What do you want to learn from the interview? What's the background literature, at least a little bit of it, so that you can know where and when it could be interesting or productive to probe and follow up, because not everything that a study participant says is necessarily going to be, a rich avenue to pursue for a research question. So I don't know, as an early career person myself, I'm figuring out how do I train up and support teams of interviewers who haven't, maybe have no experience or very little experience. And so I start out with, providing the study design so that they can read the design of the study, the rationale behind it. And then I give them maybe like 3 or 4 articles that I feel like are really kind of like crucial for understanding what, what we're trying to learn about. So if there's anybody else on the call who has the experience of teaming or training a team, I'd love to hear about how you kind of resource your interviewers so that they can really understand what they're trying to achieve in the interview.
So the question in the chat from Willie is about offering using multiple choice questions as a sort of jumping off point. Sort of giving people multiple choices, including the option of or something else, and asking people if they can help you understand. And so Willie's asking about our thoughts on that approach.
So I think for myself personally, and this is where I'm gonna go back to the disclaimer I gave at the very beginning of the presentation. This is just my approach. So in my approach, I try to stay away from multiple choice questions because I think that it does shape the kind of like the universe of possibilities for the person when they're responding to you. But Chad, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts or other people's thoughts about that.
Yeah, I also avoid using multiple choice in my interviews. I will sometimes, if the participant asks, I will give them some examples of just to sort of illustrate what I'm asking of them. But I usually don't frame it as a choice, as a multiple choice question, for the same reasons you just explained. I think I'm much more interested in getting whatever comes to mind for them. So what they tell me may be so far away from what choices I might offer, and they are less likely to give us that if we are giving them those choices.
Yeah, great.
Can I just jump in and say one thing?
Please.
I thank you, Willie, for sharing this strategy that you're noting is not necessarily one that you've used in an interview setting. But I respect Esther Perel so much that it does make me want to listen to some of her interviews to see how this comes off. So I'm definitely open to the idea of using the device of multiple choice with the or something else as the opening for those who do not see themselves in the choices offered.
Great. I'm loving this chat, guys. This is fun. Everybody's really participating. All right. Well, let's see. Where were we? So being resourced as the interviewer in order to be able to probe well. So probes there are several different kinds of probes, and there's just 3 that we're going to highlight today. So these are elaboration, clarification, and contrast probes. And so I'll just give some examples briefly. Chad, you want to forward through them?
Yeah, and before we do, Julia, you did ask about training teams and resourcing. And so I was leaving space for people, but I will say that one of the things that I always encourage people to do when I've trained interviewers is to memorize their guide. I always memorize my guide. And so what that allows me to do is as I'm talking to participants, I can picture in my head when they are answering other questions on the guide. I can think ahead and think, well, they're starting to talk about this thing that I was going to ask later. So let's probe more here. And so you're going to give a bunch of examples about how to probe, but there are some standard ones that I go back to over and over again. And so I always say, when all else fails, just ask them to tell you more, right?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. I love that. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about the interview guide. I don't think I've ever made myself completely memorize it before going into my first interview, to be perfectly honest with you, but that is probably the best case scenario. But definitely being super familiar and having practiced with the interview guide several times before you actually go into a real interview, that's ideal. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, all right, so moving on, elaboration probes. So this is when a person has, in the example that Chad gave, some people are just, not very long-winded in how they express themselves. And so you could get a very simple, short answer that just does not have a lot of nuance or complexity or richness to it. And so this is where you're going to kind of insist a little bit as the interviewer. And I try to, with elaboration probes, I try to exude curiosity, when I'm trying to get the participant to continue to talk. So, can you please, oh, I'm really interested in that. Can you please say more about that? You can use the verbal cues like, definitely, nodding. I usually leave an interview feeling like my neck's about to fall off, or I guess my head is about to fall off my neck, but I do a lot of leaning in, a lot of nodding. And just the different ways that we can try to get a person to understand that we really want to understand more. How did all of that come about? Can you please say more about that? Chad? All right. So another kind of probe would be a clarification probe. So this is when you don't really fully understand what the person means by something, or as we'll touch on later, the person assumes that you know what they mean. So they've kind of used a shorthand way to talk about it, assuming that you understand, and maybe you do understand, but if it's not, there on the interview transcript, then it's not data. So this is when you want them to clarify. So you said the evaluation was success. What do you mean by success? So what do you mean by whatever the thing is something that I think a lot of us use a lot of the time. I want to make sure I understand. It would help if you could say more about that. Another one that I really enjoy using is if a person's assuming that I kind of know what they mean, and so they're using a shorthand way of expressing themselves, I'll say, how would you describe that for someone who hasn't had that experience? Or how would you describe that for someone who hasn't been there? And I've even just used really nerdy phrasings like, just imagine, I'm an alien and I just have no idea what you're talking about. Can you describe that for someone who just really has no point of reference? All right, next one. So a contrast probe would be a way to elicit more clarification around what a person means by a topic or how it differs from something else, that you've been talking about. So it gives them something to push off of to define the boundary of the response. Very nicely put way that Kim phrased it. So in an example from my research, like one of my interview guides is interested in how a participant was using different substances within different situations in their day. So I could ask for a contrast. So how does using cannabis in that moment when you're stressed out compare with smoking a cigarette when you're stressed out? So ask for a compare and a contrast. Or what do you think that event would have been like in a conference room instead of a bar? So kind of getting at drawing out differences so that we can better understand the boundaries of how they're experiencing or perceiving something. All right, next slide. And so just kind of a final reminder, and I already said this basically. But if a participant doesn't say it, it isn't data. So I always try, when I'm interviewing, I'm trying to imagine the transcript that's going to come out of this. And so if the participant and I have a really meaningful interaction and exchange about something, but that person hasn't verbalized what my understanding is of their experience, it's not data. So this can happen very frequently when the interviewer and the interviewee have shared a lot of life experiences, or at least shared experiences that are relevant to the topic on the interview. And in that scenario, the participant might rightly think, this person knows exactly what I mean. And so they'll say, you know what I mean, or something to that effect. And that's when it's the interviewer's job to ask for, to probe, like we were just talking about, to ask that person to verbalize what it is that they assume that you understand. All right. So reining in, redirecting. So it is absolutely part of your job as an interviewer to redirect the conversation from time to time. Anyway, enough said about that. Let's move on to the next slide. I feel like I'm taking up too much time here. So rating techniques. So there are some very highly verbal participants, and they are wonderful. And also some very highly verbal participants will talk about topics that really you can identify are well outside the scope of your interview. So you want to give freedom for the individual to express themselves. You also need to respect their time that they have dedicated to the study. And so if after 60 minutes, 50% of what they talked about was not really, does not relate to the study, then that's really not a good use of their time, is how I think about it. So in these situations, we need to redirect people and toward the content that will be useful for the study. So in these cases, we stop giving verbal or non-verbal cues. We jump in with a question as soon as there's, a little bit of a pause. You even sometimes have to interrupt the person and say something like, let me stop you there for a minute. I want to make sure I really understand something that you were just saying, and then kind of redirecting to the topic that you were on before they went off onto something that's not relevant to your study. Or you could say, let me stop you here for a moment because what you're talking about right now is something I really want to get to later in the interview. So that's redirecting them to let them know that's a topic that's really valuable information. I want to save that for later because we're going to talk about it later. Okay, Chad.
Yeah, I just want to note there's Martina had a comment in there about if participants don't say it isn't data slide, talking about the valuable information we can get from silences or body language. And so just asking for thoughts about that.
I love that. I think maybe what I mean by something not being data is that at the end of the day, at least in my experience, we analyze transcripts, and unless there's a video recording of the interview, it's hard for me to imagine how the body language becomes data in the sense that it's part of the transcript that you analyze. But that the silences or body language or tears or laughter or whatever it is absolutely part of what goes into the conversation, right? Like producing the data. At least that's how I would respond. Chad, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And it also, as Kim is pointing out, can be captured in your field notes as well. And so it definitely can be captured in other ways, for sure.
That is true.
Yeah.
All right. Tracking time and wrapping up. Speaking of, we're almost at the top of the hour when I said we were going to take a break. So yeah. Strategies for managing time. So this is really important because, like I said, a lot of my study participants are very busy people who are, kind of not sneaking in the interview, but squeezing the interview into their lives. So I want to be respectful of their time if they say, at 2 o'clock, I really got to get out of here and pick up my son or whatever. So at that point, we need to have we need good skills around how to manage the flow of the content of the interview so that you can cover all the topics that you want to cover within a certain time frame. We don't always have the participant I once had a 4-hour interview with a person who was on dialysis because they were like, well, you're here and I'm on dialysis for 4 hours, so let's just talk. But most people are not going to have that life situation. So some strategies are to discuss time management with the participant at the beginning of the interview, to do time checks with them, which is something that I definitely do. Like, hey, we've got a half hour left on the interview. How you doing? Hey, we've got 10 minutes left on the interview. How you doing? More often than not, participants will say, I can stay another 10 minutes or whatever and go over. But you want to discuss the time management with them. Also having a timekeeping tool that's visible out and letting them know that you're going to be checking it is appropriate. And then another strategy could be to set an alarm that goes off 10 to 15 minutes before you're done. Another strategy that I didn't list here is to kind of, as you go along with your data collection, to get a feeling for how long different sections of the interview take and then try to pace yourself accordingly. At the end of the interview, I always ask participants, is there anything here that we didn't cover that you'd like to add, or is there anything that you're surprised that we didn't talk about today? So I just it's kind of like my last, is there anything important that we didn't get to here? And then to have an opportunity to talk about it. And a good point is that the end of the interview does not mean the end of data collection. Being prepared to take down notes about a conversation that happened after data collection is also really important. And I think we're ready for the next slide.
And I think that is probably a really good place to break, because before I get into talking about skills.
Love it. All right, so let's go ahead, everybody, and take a 5-minute break. And so we will be back, in 5 minutes. Let's just say that. All right.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Oh, okay. Got it. So in a qualitative interview, since we are not using surveys or computers, for example, to collect data, what that means is that the interviewer, along with the interview guide, are essentially the data collection instruments. Because of this, the quality of an interview is highly dependent on the skills and the training of the interviewer. The interviewer is the person that is asking the questions, receiving the answer, and responding with probes to deepen the answer. And so if the interviewer has the skills to do that, the quality of the interview is better. And these are the reasons why we are talking so much about these types of skills, because if you are collecting data, say using an iPad and a Qualtrics survey or some sort of digital, some sort of survey that's online, for example, the survey is what it is, and participants are just inputting their answers. But with the interview, it is up to us to ensure that we are collecting the data that we actually need to collect and getting the information that's important for answering our research question. And so for participants to feel really safe and be ready to be open and share their stories and their perspectives, the interviewer needs to be genuinely interested in the topic and the participant. I believe very strongly that interviewees can tell. It's pretty obvious to them if the interviewer is not interested, if the interviewer is not engaged and not wanting to learn from them. If you are sitting down, as Julia mentioned earlier, if you're sitting down and just asking question after question, that can feel a lot like you're not really interested in me. You're not really interested in this topic. You just want to extract information from me, right? And that's a very different thing than being interested in trying to learn from a person. It's also really important to be thoughtful about the approach that's taken to ensure that a sensitive approach is used, particularly when talking about really sensitive issues, things that are really emotional for people. And a qualitative interview is not a normal conversation. We are there to collect data. We want to connect with our participants, but we are there to collect data. So it is really important to be prepared, to be focused, and to try to keep the conversation on track. In our normal conversations with our friends or family or coworkers, we have a much more loosely structured conversation. There's rarely silence, right? When you're having a conversation with your friends, you don't really sit in silence that often. But in an interview, allowing space for that silence is really important. And because sometimes participants need a moment to think, maybe something is an emotional topic for them and they need a moment. So allowing that silence, which is difficult for most of us to sit in silence with another person, that is really important in the interview setting. A good interview is attentive, is really listening closely to what participants are saying. The way that you can show participants that you're really listening is to use their own language back when you're reflecting back to them. When you ask follow-up questions, you use the language that they used. And so that is one way to communicate that you are really listening. And so and a good interview is always looking for promising areas that they can follow up on. I see two questions. Phrasing of asking permission to stop. I must have missed something. But the other question that I see is how much silence should one allow before you move on? It's a really good question and a really hard question to answer. And the reason I think it's hard to answer is because it really depends on the participant. It depends on the topic, the setting, all of that matters. So when I was interviewing my participants about disclosing their HIV positive status to family members, I could see in their eyes that for some of them, this was a really emotional topic. And so I could tell that they were sort of processing my question and thinking about how to answer it, or maybe trying to compose themselves. And so I allowed a little more space there. But then there are other times when you can tell that a participant is actually looks as though they may not understand your question. Maybe they're a little bit confused about what you're trying to get at. And so in those situations, I might not allow as much silence. I may try to rephrase my question or offer a little bit more context. And so a lot goes into how you determine how long to allow that silence to sit. Julia, if you are following the chat, if there was something above that that I missed, will you let me know?
Yeah, no, you didn't. Yeah, you're right on with the question about silence. Yeah. Got it.
So one of the most important first steps, and I say continuing, it's an ongoing thing, is establishing rapport. And so Kim mentioned this earlier at the beginning. So establishing rapport is really just quickly sort of creating a dynamic where things feel positive and relaxed. Participants feel more comfortable talking to you. This is done largely by making sure that you present yourself as someone who is not judging them, that you are open to their stories, that you are not there to tell them they're right or wrong about what they tell you. And I'll say that for me personally, I do a lot of work in communities that I feel connected to, that I am a part of. And so oftentimes I will start interviews by sharing a little bit more about myself personally, to share a little bit more about things that I think will make them understand where I'm coming from and help them to feel safe telling me things, because I share some identity or experience with them. This is not something that you have to do. You need to be comfortable doing that. I am comfortable doing that, but it is one of the ways that I try to build rapport with my participants, because I'm asking them to be very vulnerable. And so I feel like it's important for me to show them that I'm also willing to share a bit with them. Participants will talk much more freely and openly when they feel comfortable with the interviewer, when they feel like they can trust you. They're not concerned about their own stories being shared outside of the interview, et cetera. And they believe that you're actually interested in hearing their story and understanding them.
I'll just take a quick pause. There's more in the chat about silences. I mean, silences are hard, right, to figure out. So Jason is saying the amount of silence depends on whether it's an in-person interview or a Zoom or phone interview. On a phone interview, too much silence can make the participants feel the connection dropped, which, yeah, that makes sense. And in person, you can go with body language, facial expressions to indicate when the person is ready to move on. So,
absolutely, yep. Yeah, I completely agree, Jason. And that is more of what I meant when I talked about, there's so much that goes into making that decision about how much silence, and those are definitely more things to think about, and especially given where we are with COVID and how most of us who are doing qualitative work are doing it virtually. And so that also changes the dynamic of the interview and how you handle things like that. So Chris, did you see Kristen's question?
I was gonna give you a heads up.
Yeah, so Kristen's asking what type or how much information about yourself is appropriate to share with them. I don't know that my answer to this question is the quote unquote correct answer as a qualitative researcher, but I will tell you what I do. If it depends on the topic of the interview. So I will tell you that I am identify as a Black gay man. I have been living with HIV for 20 years. I am from Louisiana. And so I was interviewing Black gay men living with HIV in Baton Rouge, where I grew up. And it was very important to people in the community there because of the levels of stigma and homophobia in the community, HIV stigma and homophobia in the community. It was very important for some of my participants to know who I was and what my relationship to the topic was. I know that because before recruiting for the study, community members told me that. Community members asked me about my HIV status. They asked me why are you doing this research here? They felt that researchers from New York and San Francisco come to the South, collect data, and then leave. And so a lot of them were very skeptical about me until they learned a little bit more about me. And so I shared that with them at the beginning of my interviews. I could literally see some of them, their bodies relax, and some of them start to feel less tense. And so I think for me, this is information I'm comfortable sharing with people. It wasn't hard for me to do that. But I did that because I could tell that it made a difference for them. It made a difference in terms of what they felt they could safely share with me and how open they could be about their stories. And so I think the only thing I would add to that is that you have to decide what you are comfortable sharing if you feel like it is something that you want to share with your participants. So, there's no real easy answer to that. Julia, did you have thoughts about whether it's appropriate to share and what's appropriate to share?
I think it's a hard question to answer because it depends on, so like you were just demonstrating so many different factors. Like, is it a topic that is, very uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about? Is it a, a highly stigmatized topic? And in that case, like I would want to do whatever I could to put a person at ease. It's like, if I share something about myself, is that going to shape the way that they the way that they respond, and think about that? It's really hard. I'm just trying to think of in my own examples. So in doing work with sexual and gender minority communities in the Bay Area, I would just frankly, like less directly, I would just say, in our community, blah, blah, blah. And I will agree with what you're saying, Chad. I could feel a person kind of relax and like, oh, okay, so what we're going to talk about today in terms of substance use and sexual and gender identity, like this person might have some sort of a understanding, and they, might be, I guess feeling less judged is what you want the other person to understand. I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but I'm rambling because it's a really hard question to answer, I think, because it depends on the topic, the person, the setting. Yeah,
absolutely. And the other end of that spectrum, in my own experiences, I've done interviews where I don't particularly have a close connection to the topic, and I don't share a lot about myself because it's not relevant, right? And so it really does depend on the situation that you find yourself in and your own comfort level, of course. So now my slides won't advance at all. So I don't know if, they don't. Oh, okay, there we go. So just a few things to think about when it comes to building rapport. You have to we need to establish comfort and respect with the participant. That's some of what we were just talking about. Make sure to let participants know that you are there to learn from them, that you are there to get their perspective and their thoughts, and that you're open to whatever those might be. And we've talked about this in a couple of different contexts, but different personalities, different communication styles, different emotional states. It's really important to sort of pay close attention to how the person you're interacting with engages, how they communicate, what seems to work for them and what doesn't. Sometimes participants, you need to tread very softly. There are times where I've had participants where I've asked really tough questions and very direct questions, but that was only after I had gotten a sense that this person might be okay with me sort of asking them sort of a challenging question. And that's certainly something you want to avoid doing until you're feeling very comfortable as an interviewer, because sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so asking questions, probing, maintaining neutrality. So nothing the person says will make you think more or less of them, and they need to believe that. One note on neutrality that's really important to remember is that you don't want to be so neutral that you seem like you're not responsive to the participant's emotional state. So if someone is telling you a really traumatic story, and it's clearly something that's emotional and difficult for them, if you sit there, and this was Julia's example, if you sit there and you're just like, tell me more about that, and you can see that the person is having a hard time, they're emotional. If you just maintain this neutral face, like you're not fazed by their emotional state, that could backfire on you. And so it's really important to be neutral, but also recognize what's happening in the room. And this part is the stuff that we call the messy human interaction. I use constructivist grounded theory a lot, and one central piece of that is to recognize that the interview situation, so to speak, is made up of two people in a room together, two humans in a room together. And so Sharmaz says the research reality arises in a situation and includes what researchers and participants bring to it and do within it. And so important in that phrase is researchers and participants, you are in the room. You are part of creating the environment that the research is being conducted in. So the tone of the interview, the nature of it, what biases you might have, what knowledge or experiences you might have, those things are all swirling around in your head and in your body. And so you have to recognize that you are coming into this situation and you are a part of what shapes it and what you get out of it. We are not dispassionate, objective beings. We are humans. And so we can't go into an interview thinking that we are going to be completely objective, because that's not possible. What is important is that you are able to set aside, to the extent that you can, beliefs and opinions and experiences that you've had, and try to focus on understanding the participant's perspective. I have interviewed people who have said incredibly offensive things to me. And to pretend that I was just sitting there objectively hearing this information would be a lie. I was boiling inside. And there have been times when I have said that to participants, that something they said was really bothering me, because I'm human and the other person is also a human. And so we can't pretend that we just in there acting like an actual data collection tool, like a computer, as I mentioned earlier. Rapport, again, is a journey. It's not a destination. You can't build rapport at the beginning of the interview and then forget to do the work to maintain it throughout the interview, because that is also really important. You are not a robot. Don't replace your personality with a robot avatar. And I say that because I have trained interviewers who were lively, fun, warm, engaging people who walked into an interview and turned into robots. And so after the interview, my question is, where did you go? Where did your personality go? It's okay to laugh and feel emotion and engage with your participants in a way that makes them feel like they're talking to a human being. Someone is unmuted and it's, Rochelle, I don't know if you can mute people. That would be great. I think the person doesn't know. Okay, great. All interviews, a one-on-one interview involves humans. And so it's really important for us to remember that we are interacting with human beings, and we need to act as though we are interacting with human beings and not just acting as data collection tools.
Can I underline what you just said, because I love it so much? Imagine pouring your heart out to somebody and then they don't mirror back the emotion that you're expressing. At least for me, if I were being interviewed, I would take that as a cue where it's time to wrap that up, Julia. They don't want to hear about that, not interested, let's move on. So it's not only okay to mirror the emotion, I think it's super necessary to mirror the emotion, or at least to validate it, acknowledge it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this was something that Willie brought up earlier in the chat about acknowledging what the person is experiencing. Sort of, I often will say, I can tell this is really hard for you. We can take a break, or if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear more about that, right? So acknowledging that you see that the person is emotional, or if it's something they're happy about, I say, I can tell you're really excited about that. Can you tell me about it? All right. So acknowledging that you're paying attention to what's going on with them in the room. So it's also important to remember, or to be thinking about, all the stuff that's going to be going on in your head. You might be in your head thinking about making sure you cover all the questions. You may be thinking, what is my facial expression conveying? You're worrying about what the participant thinks of you, for example. The participant may be wondering, what is it that the interviewer wants me to say? What do they want from me? They may be concerned about saying something that makes them or their group or their family look bad. They may be wondering how much they can trust the interviewer. And so again, the messy human stuff, these things are going on in our heads while we're sitting in an interview as the interviewer or the participant. And so it's also really important for us to be conscious about what's going on in our heads, because that can distract us from hearing the participant. It can distract us from following our interview guide and paying attention to where we are in our interview. I know this has happened to me many, many times where my brain has gotten stuck on, I said something or asked a question in a way that may have come off in a way that like offended the participant, or maybe it gave them the wrong impression about me or something like that. And it's distracting. So again, important to think about our humanness. And let's jump to the next couple slides. We're running out of time. So this is just an example about how we can respectfully respond to questions from participants. Participants will regularly ask you your opinion about something, ask you to give them information about something. This example is from one of my interviews. I was interviewing men about disclosing their HIV status. Basically, how disclosure is just how people convey to other people that they are living with HIV or that they're HIV negative. And so this participant had told me that he doesn't tell anybody his HIV status, people he's dating, friends, family, no one. And he said to me at one point, I kind of want to know how you feel about the way I feel about it. And my response to him was, we can talk more about that after we're done. I don't really have a strong feeling about whether you disclose or not. I'm really just curious to learn how you think about it and how you make those decisions. So I answered his question in a way, but I made it clear to him that I want to hear from him. I didn't allow the conversation to turn into him asking me what I think about things, because that can sometimes happen if you allow participants to take you down that road. And when people ask for information, I tend to say, I'm more than happy to give you more information about that at the end of the interview. And I add something like, please don't let me forget, so that they know that I'm serious about following up and giving them that information. So, Julia, our last few slides.
Our last few slides, we just want to underline that interviewing is a practice. So you need to do it over and over and over and over again. And that's how you learn. Attending, workshops is great. It's a great jumping off point, but actually doing it is really what needs to happen. We can go to the next slide. We can skip over this. This is my kumbaya slide. I love interviewing as a way to be in the world, both for the interviewer and the interviewee. And so just kind of enjoying it and relishing it is, just something that I think we have an opportunity to do with this line of work. And final slide, I think, is not quite final slide. We have not covered some really core kind of things here. So we just want to underline that, how do you actually create an interview guide? Writing field notes is super important to do after interviews. We haven't touched on that. How do you manage your data, et cetera? So this is a very specific presentation, and there's a lot more to learn out there. And on that note, we will be sending out some more resources for self-study after we're finished today. It might come out tomorrow, but this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as interviewing goes. And Chad, I'm just so grateful that you agreed to co-present. I really enjoyed having your perspective, your input. I love the way you talk about things. Would love to have you back again to do this or any other, seminar with the Qualitative Working Group. And I'm super happy to stay on and chat with anybody who wants to unmute themselves and talk or do more chat. But for anybody else who needs to jump off, Kim, any last final words?
No, I just want to also say thank you so much, Chad. You are, yes, you're such a wonderful teacher. And I hope that both you and Julia feel the appreciation from the comments. And this was just a really rich discussion too. So Thank you.
Thank you both for that. I had a great time. I love qualitative work, so it was a great privilege to do this.